In the history of the United States, the role of the First Lady is often seen as ceremonial, a hostess, a supportive wife, a figure in the background. But in 1981, a woman entered the White House who would redefine that role forever. She wasn't just a partner, she was the silent architect of a presidency. Her name was Nancy Reagan. To the public, she was the epitome of grace and just say no, but behind the scenes, she was known as the Dragon Lady, a woman who possessed a political instinct sharper than any advisor in Washington. She was the gatekeeper. To get to the president, you had to go through Nancy, and if she didn't like you, your career was over before lunch. But her most shocking secret wasn't her political influence or her expensive taste in gowns. It was the fact that for 7 years, the movements of the leader of the Western world were being decided by the alignment of the stars. This is the story of the woman who ran the White House with an iron fist and a secret astrologer. The assassination attempt. March 30th, 1981. 69 days into the Reagan presidency. In a matter of seconds, the world stopped spinning. A lone gunman, John Hinckley Jr., opened fire. A bullet ricocheted off the presidential limousine and lodged itself just an inch from Ronald Reagan's heart. As the president was rushed to the hospital, his life hanging by a thread, the person most affected wasn't the vice president or the cabinet, it was Nancy. For Nancy, this wasn't just a national security crisis, it was her worst nightmare made real. She had always been protective, but after the shooting, that protectiveness turned into an obsession. She became convinced that the Secret Service couldn't truly protect her husband. She felt that the government was blind to the invisible forces that governed life and death. In her desperation, Nancy turned to an old friend from her Hollywood days, named Merv Griffin. She asked a question that would change the course of American history. Who is the best person to tell me when Ronnie is safe? The answer led her to a woman in San Francisco named Joan Quigley, an astrologer. From that moment on, Nancy Reagan was no longer just the First Lady. She became a secret commander. She was terrified that another bad day was written in the stars. Every trip, every speech, every meeting with world leaders like Mikhail Gorbachev, none of it could happen until Joan Quigley checked the alignment of the planets. The White House was now being run on a schedule determined by the cosmos. The staff at the White House began to notice. Schedules were changed at the last minute for no apparent reason. Air Force One was delayed because the stars weren't aligned for a safe takeoff. Nancy was building a wall around the president, and that wall was made of secrets and superstition. She was determined that no one would ever hurt her Ronnie again, no matter the cost to the country's sanity. But as Nancy's influence grew, so did her list of enemies. The Dragon Lady was about to clash with the most powerful men in Washington, and the stars were predicting a storm that even she couldn't control. The secret consultant. To the Chief of Staff, it was a nightmare. To the Cabinet, it was an interference. But to Nancy, Joan Quigley was the only person she could trust. For 7 years, the White House had a secret payroll. Joan Quigley was paid $3,000 a month, not by the government, but from Nancy's own pocket, to ensure that the President of the United States was in cosmic alignment with his duties. Every major event was color-coded. Joan would send Nancy calendars marked with good days, bad days, and caution days. If a summit with the Soviet Union fell on a bad day, Nancy would force the entire US government to move it. Press conferences, surgery dates, even the timing of the 1984 re-election announcement, all were dictated by the position of the planets. The leader of the free world was, quite literally, moving through time according to an astrologer's map. Even the most critical moments of the Cold War weren't immune. When Reagan and Gorbachev signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the timing was set to the exact minute Joan Quigley prescribed. The staff at the White House grew frustrated. They called it the Nancy factor. Meetings were cancelled without explanation. It was a tug-of-war between the scientific advisors of the most powerful nation on Earth and a woman in San Francisco reading the zodiac. But it wasn't just about safety. Nancy used the astrology to manage her husband's image and his legacy. She knew Ronald was a man of the people, but he was also aging. She used Joan's advice to hide his vulnerabilities and to pick the moments when he would look the strongest. In her mind, she wasn't being superstitious, she was being strategic. She was the architect of his survival. But secrets of this magnitude cannot be kept forever. In the hallways of the West Wing, a rebellion was brewing. The men in suits were tired of being told no by the stars. And when the truth finally leaked, it wouldn't just be a scandal, it would be a betrayal that would threaten to pull the entire Reagan legacy down with it. The war on drugs and the Queen persona. To the American public, Nancy Reagan was the face of morality. Her Just Say No campaign against drugs was the centerpiece of her public life. She traveled the country, hugged children, and sat on the lap of Mr. T at Christmas. It was the ultimate PR move. But while she was telling the youth of America to resist temptation, Nancy was struggling with her own public image problem. Behind the scenes, the First Lady was being accused of something the American public found hard to swallow: extreme, unapologetic excess. In the middle of a recession, while millions of Americans were struggling to pay their bills, Nancy spent over $200,000 on a new set of china for the White House. She claimed it was for the dignity of the office, but the press saw it differently. They saw a woman out of touch with reality. They began to call her Queen Nancy, a woman who wore $10,000 gowns donated by designers, often forgetting to report them as gifts, while preaching austerity to the masses. The criticism was relentless. The media portrayed her as a cold, calculating socialite who cared more about the thread count of her sheets than the policies of the country. But Nancy didn't back down. She used her power to curate every inch of the Reagan brand. She knew that in the 80s, image was everything. If Ronald was the hero of the story, she had to be the queen. And queens do not apologize for their crowns. This duality defined the Reagan years. The Just Say No grandmother versus the First Lady of fashion. But as the critics focused on her clothes and her dishes, they were missing the real power play. Nancy wasn't just choosing the china, she was choosing the people who stayed in the room. And her next move would be her most ruthless yet: the total purging of anyone who dared to challenge her influence. The Dragon Lady was about to breathe fire, and the first person to get burned would be the most powerful man in the West Wing. The gatekeeper. In the West Wing, they had a saying: if Nancy doesn't like you, you're already gone. You just don't know it yet. By the mid-1980s, Nancy Reagan had evolved from a supportive wife into the ultimate gatekeeper. She controlled who saw the president, what information reached his desk, and most importantly, who was allowed to stay in his inner circle. She was the filter through which the entire Reagan presidency passed. The most famous casualty of Nancy's wrath was Ronald Reagan, the White House Chief of Staff. He was a powerful man, a former Wall Street titan who thought he ran the building. But he made one fatal mistake. He hung up on Nancy during a phone argument. Not once, but twice. Nancy didn't just get mad, she got even. She convinced Ronald that Reagan was responsible for the scandals plaguing the administration. Within weeks, the most powerful man in Washington was forced to resign. He found out his career was over from a news report, a final sting from the First Lady. But as the second term progressed, Nancy's control became a necessity. Those close to the president began to notice small things, a forgotten name, a repeated story, a moment of confusion. While the public saw a strong leader, Nancy saw the early signs of a fading mind. She stepped into the vacuum. She began whispering answers into his ear during interviews. She edited his speeches to make them simpler. She was no longer just the First Lady. She was an associate president, protecting the man she loved from a world that was starting to notice his decline. Critics called it a coup in heels. They argued that an unelected woman was running the country based on the advice of an astrologer. But for Nancy, it was an act of ultimate devotion. She was the shield. She was the memory. She was the one keeping the legend of Ronald Reagan alive, even as the man himself began to slip away into the long goodbye. But every reign must come to an end. As they prepared to leave the White House, Nancy knew the greatest battle of her life was just beginning. A battle not against political rivals or the press, but against an enemy that no amount of power could defeat. The long goodbye. In 1989, the Reagans left the world stage and retreated to the hills of California. But for Nancy, the vacation never came. In 1994, Ronald Reagan penned a heartbreaking letter to the American people, announcing he had Alzheimer's disease. The man who had faced down empires was now losing the battle for his own mind. And Nancy, the woman who had spent decades protecting his image, now had to protect his dignity in total isolation. For 10 long years, Nancy Reagan lived what she called the long goodbye. She stayed by his side as he forgot the presidency, forgot his friends, and eventually forgot her name. The Queen of the White House was now a nurse in a quiet mansion. But even in the shadows, she remained a fighter. She broke away from her own political party to advocate for stem cell research, hoping to find a cure that came too late for her Ronnie, but might save others. It was her final act of defiance. When Ronald Reagan died in June 2004, the world saw the Dragon Lady break. As she leaned over his casket at the Reagan Library, the iron mask finally slipped. She wasn't the First Lady, the gatekeeper, or the strategist. She was a woman losing the only person who ever truly knew her. She had spent a lifetime making sure he was the star. Now, she was left alone on an empty stage. Nancy Reagan passed away in 2016 at the age of 94. She was buried right beside her husband, overlooking the hills of Simi Valley. History will remember her for the china, the clothes, and the astrologer. They will call her manipulative, cold, and calculated. But they cannot deny one thing. She was the most powerful First Lady in American history. She didn't just stand beside the president, she stood behind the wheel. Because Nancy Reagan understood something that the world often forgets. That behind every great man, there isn't just a supportive wife, there is a silent architect, building a legacy that even time and the stars cannot erase. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and stay with us, because behind every fortune there is a story rarely told.